The sound was the first thing to break the quiet. It wasn't the roar of the Pacific surf which had finally calmed its rage. It wasn't the cry of a gull. It was a low, agonizing whine, not human, canine. Shadow, a Belgian Malinois sculpted from black shadow and disciplined muscle, was failing. And he knew it. He was a K9, but more than that, he was a specialist. A cadaver dog. He was trained, certified, and battle-tested. His nose was a finely calibrated instrument that associated the complex chemical signature of human decomposition. The smell of death. With purpose. With a reward. With finding the lost, but this was wrong. The storm had ripped the island's coastline to shreds, and this scent, churned up from God knows where, was an offense. It was death, yes, but it was corrupted. It was ancient. Shadow backed away from the mass of splintered driftwood and churned up sand, his paws sinking. He whined again, a high-pitched sound of pure neurological confusion. It was a sound his partner, Officer Cade Miller, had heard only once before, when a rattlesnake had struck the dog's vest. It was the sound of fear. He looked at Cade, his dark eyes wide, screaming a single, desperate word. No. If that opening already has you hooked, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. You think you know where this is going. Trust me, you don't. And you won't want to miss what Shadow found. Now let's set the scene. The air on this remote stretch of the Pacific Northwest Island wasn't just cold. It was heavy. It tasted of pulverized salt, shattered pine resin, and the metallic sting of ozone left by the storm of the century. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly purple gray that promised more rain but was too exhausted to deliver. Officer Cade Miller pulled the collar of his rain slicker tighter. He was a man who matched the landscape, weathered, quiet, and preferring isolation. He'd taken the post on this island off the Washington coast to escape the noise of the mainland, to trade the complexities of people for the simple truths of tides and trees. And of course for Shadow, easy boy. What is it? Cade said, his voice a low rumble. He moved toward his partner, his boots crunching on wet sand and broken shells. Cade trusted Shadow's nose more than he trusted his own eyes. The dog had never been wrong, not once. He'd found hikers who'd fallen into ravines, fishermen pulled under by sleeper waves and worse. But he'd always been clinical about it, focused. This was different. Shadow wasn't just alerting. He was recoiling. Show me, Cade commanded, his voice gentle but firm. Shadow crept forward, low to the ground, his body language a mess of contradictions. He wanted to flee, but his training propelled him forward. He led Cade past a massive root ball torn from an ancient cedar, to a scar in the beach where the storm surge had acted like a bulldozer. And then Cade smelled it. It wasn't the sharp, coppery smell of a recent drowning. It wasn't the sour rot of sea life stranded too long. It was dusty. It smelled of attics, of old books, of something that should have been sealed away deep underground. It was the scent of forgotten time, layered over the unmistakable, pungent odor of decay. My God, Cade whispered, pulling his flashlight from his belt, even though the afternoon light was sufficient. It was a reflex, a cop's habit of shining a light into dark places. Shadow stood rigid, his gaze locked on a dark object half buried in the sand. It wasn't driftwood. It was black, rectangular, and bound with what looked like tarnished brass. The storm had done the heavy digging, excavating this thing from a depth Cade couldn't even guess. It was a chest. A massive sea chest, the kind you see in pirate movies or antique shops. But this one was real, its wood blackened and swollen by seawater, yet stubbornly intact. Okay. Good boy. Back, Cade said, his hand resting on Shadow's head to calm the dog's trembling. Cade approached it alone. He could see now that the wood wasn't just black. It was ebony or something like it. Intricately carved, though the details were blurred by time and brine. The brass bands were green with oxidization, and it was cracked. A fissure ran diagonally across the lid, a fresh break from being smashed against the rocks. It was from this crack that the impossible scent was leaking. Cade knew the protocol. He should secure the area, call it in, wait for the county sheriff and maybe the state archaeologist. But the storm had knocked out the island's main repeater tower. His radio was static. He was alone out here. Shadow whined again, a low, urgent vibration. He was sensing Cade's curiosity, pleading with him. Leave it. Walk away. Cade couldn't. He holstered his flashlight and knelt in the wet sand. He didn't need to pry it. He put his gloved fingers into the crack and pulled. The waterlogged wood gave way with a sickening ancient groan. The lid, heavy as a tombstone, lifted just 6 inches. Cade recoiled, gagging. The smell hit him like a physical blow, the concentrated, musty stench of a century, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the grave. He forced himself to look, shining his beam into the dark interior. He didn't see gold. He didn't see jewels. He saw the pale, unmistakable curve of a human skull, wrapped in the rotten tatters of what looked like velvet, and something glinting on its chest. Shadow let out a single sharp bark. It wasn't an alert. It was a warning. Cade didn't hear it. He was mesmerized by the object, by the impossible smell of ages. He was the first man in 140 years to see the contents of the Covenant tide chest, and he didn't know it yet. But he and Shadow were no longer alone on the beach. Cade's stomach clenched. He'd smelled death in humid apartments, in submerged cars, in the burnt-out husks of meth labs. He knew every flavor of decomposition. But this was the smell of a museum vault, of a forgotten tomb, all mixed with the biting brine of the sea. It was the smell of time itself expiring. He fought the urge to drop the lid and walk away. Shadow's sharp bark cut through the air again. "Shadow, heel!" Cade snapped, his voice harsher than intended. The dog went silent, but his anxiety radiated off him in waves, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Cade forced himself to look again, his professional training kicking in, walling off the visceral disgust. He shined his flashlight beam into the 6-inch gap. The beam landed on the pale white curve of the skull. It was small, the sutures delicate, female. The jaw was slightly open, as if fixed in a final silent gasp. The remains were draped in scraps of what had once been fine clothing. Dark, heavy velvet, maybe, or silk. Now just moldering fibers that clung to the bones like wet cobwebs. And there, resting on the fused vertebrae of the sternum, was the source of the glint. It wasn't a pile of treasure. It wasn't a cascade of gold coins. It was small, dark, and unmistakably silver. A locket. Cade's training screamed at him. "Don't touch it. Secure the scene, photograph, call the ME, medical examiner." This was a grave site, an unregistered burial, a potential homicide. But the ME was on the mainland, a 90-minute ferry ride away on a good day, and the storm had likely shut the route down. His radio was a brick of useless static. The tide was already starting to turn, its relentless fingers creeping up the beach, threatening to reclaim this patch of sand, to pull this impossible secret back into the depths. He looked back at the dense, dark tree line. Nothing. Just the wind whistling through the pines. Cade made a decision. He wasn't an archaeologist. He was a cop. And this felt like a victim. "Okay, Shadow, watch," he murmured. He pulled off his thick patrol glove, kneading his bare fingers for this. The air was frigid. But as he reached into the dark, damp space, the metal of the locket felt impossibly cold. A dense pocket of the grave. It was heavier than it looked, an oval shape about the size of a silver dollar. He drew it out. The chain it was on had long since corroded into nothing. He held it in his palm, the metal tarnished almost black. But he could make out a delicate etching on its surface, a bird, maybe a sparrow, in flight. The clasp was frozen shut by 140 years of corrosion and salt. He grunted, trying to force it with his thumbnail. It wouldn't budge. Damn it. He pulled his standard-issue multi-tool from his belt, flicked out the small knife blade, and carefully, meticulously, wedged the tip into the seam. He applied steady pressure. With a tiny, brittle snap, the hinge gave way. The locket opened. It wasn't empty. Protected under a tiny, clouded pane of glass was a photograph. Not a paper photo, but a daguerreotype, its image mirrored on a silvered plate. The technology itself was ancient, from the mid-1800s. The face that stared back at him was young, perhaps 20. She was severe, beautiful in that stark 19th century way. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, accentuating high cheekbones and wide dark eyes. She was holding a baby, a pale angelic blur bundled in white lace. Neither of them was smiling. People didn't smile for the camera then. The exposures were too long, too arduous. But the woman's eyes? Cade felt his breath catch. Even in the faded, ghostly image, he could see it. It wasn't the stoic neutrality he expected. It was fear. Her eyes were wide, haunted. Cade Miller looked down at the tiny, spectral faces in his palm, then back at the skeletal remains in the dark, wet chest. This was you. The thought was sharp and sudden. This wasn't evidence. This wasn't case file 309A. This was a person. A mother, holding her child. And she had ended up here in a box, buried under the sand of his island, clutching a picture of the very life she'd brought into the world. The cop in him receded, replaced by the man. He'd seen enough tragedy in his 20-year career to recognize it in all its forms. This wasn't a burial, this was a heartbreak. Shadow had crept closer, his fear replaced by curiosity. He nudged Cade's hand, the one holding the locket, with his cold, wet nose. It was a gesture of comfort. A check-in. "You okay, boss?" "I'm okay, boy," Cade whispered. He carefully snapped the locket shut, the click sounding impossibly loud in the quiet of the beach. He slipped it into the zippered breast pocket of his duty jacket, a violation of every rule in the book. It felt warm against his chest. "I'll hold onto this for you," he thought, a silent promise to the woman in the box. His gaze returned to the chest, his eyes now different, respectful. He saw that the skeleton was positioned strangely, almost hunched over, as if protecting something else beneath it. The tattered velvet and silk were draped over another object. A satchel. It was dark, wrapped in what looked like oilskin, its seams sealed with wax. This was no accident. The woman, the locket, the satchel. They were all part of the same terrible story. He and Shadow were just the ones who'd read the first page. The locket was a heavy, warm presence in Cade's breast pocket, resting against his ribs. It felt less like evidence and more like a trust. He took a stabilizing breath, the cold, ancient air from the chest hitting his face, and looked back inside. The woman's remains were in a state of unnatural repose. She wasn't lying flat as she would be in a proper burial. She was slightly hunched, as if she had died, or been placed, in a protective crouch over the object beneath her, the dark, oilskin-wrapped satchel. Cade's jaw tightened. There was no way to get to the satchel without disturbing her. Protocols already shot to hell, he muttered to the wind. Shadow, hearing his voice, stepped closer, nudging his master's thigh. "It's okay, boy. Just work." He set his flashlight on a dry patch of sand, angling the beam into the chest. With a reverence that felt strange on this desolate beach, Cade reached in. He put his hands on the skeleton's shoulders, the rotted velvet disintegrating under his touch, turning to black slime. "I'm sorry," he whispered to whom he didn't know. The woman in the locket, the universe. He gently, firmly lifted the skeleton's torso. It was terrifyingly light. The bones, held together by strands of desiccated tissue in the shroud of her clothes, moved as one piece. He shifted her to the side, resting her back against the inner wall of the chest. The skull lolled, its empty gaze seeming to follow him. Now the satchel was revealed. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a laptop bag, but thicker. The oilskin was black, stiff, and surprisingly intact. The storm's brine had beaded on its surface. It had been designed to repel water, to survive the sea. The flaps were folded over and sealed not with a buckle, but with thick crimson wax, like an ancient royal decree. This wasn't just luggage. This was a time capsule. Cade ran his thumb over the wax. It was brittle but hard. He used his multi-tool knife again, the blade sinking into the 140-year-old seal. It cracked and flaked away, revealing a simple leather tie underneath. He undid the knot, the leather stiff and cold. He unfolded the oilskin flaps. Cade was a cop on an island with a population of 500. He wasn't a treasure hunter. He wasn't prepared for the dull, heavy gleam that met his eyes. Gold dozens, maybe hundreds, of gold coins. He recognized the iconic Liberty head of American double eagles, mixed with the profile of a young Queen Victoria on British sovereigns. It wasn't a pirate's chest of random plunder, it was a payload, a fortune. Enough to buy this entire island, probably. This changed everything. This wasn't just a potential homicide. It was a motive. A powerful one. Cade's mind raced. Who knew? About this, was this a shipwreck or a getaway? He plunged his hand into the coins. They were cold, heavy, and real. The weight was astonishing, but as his fingers dug into the pile, they brushed against something else, something that wasn't metal. He pushed the coins aside. There, at the bottom of the satchel, lay the real treasure. It was a book. It was small, about 8 inches by 5, bound in dark, supple leather that had been perfectly preserved by the oilskin. Unlike the chest's exterior, this book was pristine. It, too, had a seal. A band of black ribbon was wrapped around it, and the knot was sealed with a different wax, this time black, stamped with an intricate sigil he couldn't make out in the gloom. This was the core. The gold was a distraction. This was the secret. Cade felt a prickle on his neck. The wind was picking up, and the tide was definitely coming in. The first waves were now licking the sand just a few yards from the chest. He didn't have time. He couldn't leave this here. He looked at the seal. Breaking the first one on the satchel felt necessary. Breaking this one. This felt like a violation, like reading someone's last will before they were gone. She's been gone for 140 years, Cade. His knife came out. He sliced the ribbon. The black wax seal split in two. He opened the cover. The first page was thick, high-quality rag paper, creamy yellow with age. The handwriting inside was not the shaky script of an old woman. It was bold, precise and elegant, written with a fountain pen in deep iron gall ink. It wasn't a diary. There was no Dear Diary. It was a ledger, a statement. Cade read the first line, written at the top of the page, dated only October 1883. His blood ran cold. The words were cryptic, chilling, and made absolutely no sense. The covenant is broken. He scanned down the page. It wasn't a narrative. It was a series of declarations, almost like a military report. The Fifth Harbor is lost. The asset is compromised. We flee the long hand. Cade frowned. Covenant. Asset. This wasn't the rambling of a settler. This was organized. It sounded clandestine. He turned the page. The last entry was on the next sheet, written in the same steady hand, but the letters were thicker, as if the author was pressing down with final, desperate force. I am the last. I take the key into the long sleep. Do not follow. Cade Miller stood up, pulling back from the chest. The wind whipped his hair. He looked at the gold, then at the book in his hand, then at the locket warm against his chest. A woman, a child, a fortune in gold, and a cryptic journal talking about a broken covenant and a lost harbor. He had just stumbled into a secret that was 140 years old, and every instinct in his body told him that its story wasn't over. The journal was a living thing in Cade's hand. The words he'd read, covenant, asset, long sleep, didn't belong to the past. They felt immediate, charged, like a military briefing. This wasn't the diary of a lost pioneer woman. It was the field report of a soldier, or a spy. He carefully placed the leather-bound book into the deep cargo pocket of his rain slicker. It was a profound breach of protocol. He was contaminating a scene, tampering with evidence. But leaving it here, with the tide surging, felt like a greater crime. The surf was closer now, a hungry, foaming line of white water just 10 feet away. The chest was in danger. He had minutes, not hours. "Okay, boy, we gotta move," he said, the words snatched by the wind. Shadow was poised, his gaze flickering between Cade and the dark, dense tree line above the beach. The dog was still on edge, sensing something Cade couldn't. Cade couldn't haul the chest. It was waterlogged and must have weighed hundreds of pounds, and that was before he'd seen the gold. He couldn't leave the remains exposed to the elements, to the gulls. He had to close it. It was the only shred of dignity he could offer the woman in the locket. He bent down, gripping the splintered, heavy lid. He put his shoulder into it, pushing. As he strained, his gloved hand slipped, scraping hard against the side of the chest. The motion wiped away a thick layer of green-black algae and accumulated ocean grime, revealing the dark wood underneath. He froze. He'd been so focused on the contents he hadn't truly seen the container. His flashlight was still on the sand, its beam pointing up. He grabbed it, centering the bright white circle on the spot his hand had just cleared. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a date. It was a sigil. It was deeply carved into the ebony wood, about the size of his hand. It was a circle, and within it, a complex, 8-pointed compass rose. The points were sharp, almost aggressive. Intersecting the compass was a fouled anchor, an ancient heavy design with the rope or chain wrapped tight around its stock. A compass and an anchor. Cade's mind flashed back to the journal in his pocket. The fifth harbor is lost. This was it. This was their mark. He stared at it, the rain starting to spit again, cold pinpricks on his face. The symbol was scratching at his memory, a persistent itch he couldn't place. He knew it. It was so familiar it made his teeth ache. He'd been on this island for 5 years, ever since the department on the mainland and a bad shooting had convinced him to find a quieter post. He'd taken the job no one else wanted. Lone officer, part-time sheriff, full-time dog walker. He had walked every trail, every beach, every overgrown logging road. He knew the island's bones. Where had he seen this? The long sleep. The journal's words echoed in his head, a sudden, cold whisper. The long sleep. And then it hit him. Not a gentle memory, but a jolt, as if someone had pressed an ice cube to the back of his neck. The graveyard, the island's old, abandoned Presbyterian church. It sat on the high northern bluff, a skeleton of a building the tourists never found and the locals avoided. It had been decommissioned in the 1920s. Its congregation long since moved away or buried in the very yard it overlooked. Cade and Shadow patrolled it sometimes, more for something to do than for any real threat. The graveyard was a mess, choked with ivy and invasive blackberries. Most of the graves were simple, worn-down marble or sandstone slabs, names of fishermen, loggers, and their wives. The dates all clustering in the late 1800s. But there was one. It was separate from the others, set back near the cliff's edge as if watching the sea. It wasn't a slab. It was an obelisk, a four-sided spire of dark, almost black granite, a stone that wasn't native to the island. It was ostentatious, severe, and completely out of place among the simple settlers' graves. Cade had stopped to look at it a dozen times, brushing away the moss. It had always bothered him. There was no name. There was no date. There was only an epitaph carved deep and sharp. He guards the harbor in the long sleep, and below that epitaph, so clear in Cade's memory now it made him short of breath, was the sigil. The 8-pointed compass and the fouled anchor. Cade Miller's blood turned to ice water. He took an involuntary step back from the chest. This wasn't a shipwreck. This wasn't some random tragedy washed ashore from halfway across the world. This was local. This woman, this gold, this covenant, it was all connected, somehow, to that nameless, ominous grave on the hill. The long sleep wasn't just a poetic phrase for death. It was a motto, a catchphrase. The grave on the hill. He guards the harbor. The journal in his pocket. The fifth harbor is lost. He looked at the woman's skull resting inside the chest. He looked at the vast, gray, uncaring Pacific. This wasn't a grave he'd found. It was a piece of a much larger, darker puzzle that had been sitting right under his nose for 5 years. This woman wasn't just buried here. She was from here, or she was running to here, and the nameless, forgotten grave on that hill. Who was he? The Guardian? A new, terrifying thought emerged, tightening his chest. The storm hadn't just uncovered this one chest. The island was riddled with these secrets. How many more Guardians were sleeping? How many more keys were buried beneath the trails he walked every day? The secret wasn't just on the island. The island was the secret. The revelation hung in the air, heavier and colder than the descending fog. The island is the secret. Cade Miller felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a cold, electric hum. The sigil on the chest, the anchor and compass, was no longer just a carving. It was a map pin, a marker that tied this 140-year-old tragedy directly to the soil he patrolled every day. The grave on the bluff wasn't an anomaly. It was a sentinel. He was so lost in this chilling epiphany, in the sudden, horrifying realignment of his quiet, isolated world, that he almost missed the change. It wasn't a sound. It was a silence. Shadow, who had been nervously pacing the high tide line, suddenly went absolutely still. Cade knew his partner's every signal. He knew the squirrel posture, the deer alert, the focused intensity of tracking. This was none of those. Shadow froze mid-stride, one paw lifted. His head, which had been facing Cade, snapped with unnatural speed toward the dense, dark tree line that marked the boundary between the beach and the island's interior. His ears pinned forward and the ruff on his neck, the thick fur canine handlers call hackles, rose in a single, rigid crest from his skull to the base of his tail. Cade didn't wait. He dropped the heavy lid of the chest. It slammed shut with a muffled, watery thud, the sound swallowed by the surf. "Shadow? What is it?" Cade whispered. The dog didn't whine as he had at the ancient scent. He didn't bark, as he would at a tourist. He growled. It was a sound Cade had only heard 3 times in their 5-year partnership, and 2 of those times had ended with gunfire. It was a sound that didn't come from the throat, but from the diaphragm. A low, vibrating, hydraulic rumble that was less a warning and more a promise of catastrophic violence. It was the imminent threat signal. Cade's hand unclipped the retention strap on his holster. The adrenaline dump was instant, burning away the cold, sharpening his vision. "Where?" he breathed. Shadow didn't move, didn't break his pointing stance. He was a black statue of focused malice, his gaze locked on a spot deep within the shadows of the forest, high up on the bluff, maybe 75 yards away, a place where the storm had snapped a massive Douglas fir, creating a dark, perfect sniper's hide. Cade drew his Sig Sauer. The metallic shing of the pistol clearing the Kydex holster was terrifyingly loud. "Show me," he whispered, his free hand gripping the leash, feeling the coiled tension in the dog. He scanned the tree line, his eyes stinging from the wind. He was looking for the things he'd been trained to see. A glint of glass, binoculars, scope, the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel, the pale oval of a human face. He saw nothing. Just a chaotic jumble of moss-covered branches, deep shadow, and the gray, weeping sky. But the dog was never wrong. Cade's heart hammered against his ribs. He was completely exposed. He was on a wide-open beach, a perfect target, silhouetted against the pale, foaming surf. The tree line was a fatal funnel, a wall of shadow that could hide anything. "Okay," Cade said, his voice low, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "Okay, boy, I see him." A lie, but a necessary one for the dog. He backed away from the chest, pulling Shadow with him, his weapon held in a 2-handed grip, pointed toward the bluff. The tide was coming in fast, a wave washing over his boots, the undertow sucking the sand from beneath his feet. He stumbled, catching his balance. Shadow never flinched. His growl deepened, his teeth now bared. He was pulling against the leash, his entire body vibrating, desperate to close the distance to meet the threat. "No. Shadow, heel, heel." Cade's mind was racing, shuffling the new, terrifying pieces of the puzzle. The storm was the perfect cover. The island's repeater tower was down. No radio, no cell service, no ferry. The island was cut off. He was completely, utterly alone with his dog, and someone was watching them. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't some local hunter stumbling upon him. You don't aim a low growl like that at a hunter. Shadow was smelling intent. He was smelling danger. The Watcher wasn't surprised to see Cade. The Watcher hadn't just arrived. The Watcher had been waiting. Waiting for what? For Cade to find the chest? Or had they been looking for it themselves and Cade had just beaten them to it? The journal in his pocket suddenly felt like a block of lead. The locket against his chest felt hot. These weren't artifacts. They were intel. They were the key the woman had died to protect. And the Watcher knew it. Cade kept moving, shuffling backward, keeping his eyes on the spot Shadow had indicated. The grave on the hill, the sigil, the covenant. This wasn't a 140-year-old secret. It was an active one, a secret someone was still to this day willing to guard. "He guards the harbor in the long sleep," Cade whispered, the words tasting like ash. The Guardian wasn't just a skeleton in a grave. The Guardian was alive and he was up in those trees. Then a sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the surf. It was the sharp, definitive snap of a heavy branch breaking under a boot. It came from the exact spot Shadow was staring at. Shadow exploded, lunging forward with a roar, hitting the end of his leash so hard it nearly ripped Cade's arm from its socket. "No."
"Shadow, here!"
Cade was no longer retreating. He was running, pulling his dog with him, scrambling sideways down the beach, using the curve of the sand as cover. They hadn't just been seen, they had been confirmed. The Watcher knew Cade had the journal. They knew he'd found the chest. The game had just changed. It was no longer a historical investigation. It was a hunt, and Cade Miller, with his dead radio and his K9 partner, had just become the prey. You don't run in a straight line. That was day one at the academy. When the shooting starts, you move. You move unpredictably. You make yourself the hardest target. Cade was running, half-crouched, yanking Shadow's leash as he scrambled sideways across the wet, sucking sand. His pistol was up, pointing toward the bluff, but he knew it was a futile gesture. A handgun against a potential rifle at 75 yards in failing light. He was outgunned, outpositioned, and completely exposed. The beach was a kill box. The dense forest was the high ground, and the roaring Pacific was the wall at his back. Come on, boy, move. Cade yelled, his voice torn away by the wind. He was angling for a cluster of black basalt rocks 50 yards down the beach, the only decent cover in sight. But Shadow was fighting him. The dog, usually a seamless extension of Cade's will, was now an anchor. He was planting his paws, pulling against the leash, his powerful neck muscles straining. Shadow, heel. Damn it, this is not the time. Cade snarled, yanking the leash hard enough to make the dog yelp. But Shadow wouldn't budge. He wasn't looking at the tree line anymore. His growl had stopped. Now he was obsessed. His focus locked on the sand right next to the half-submerged sea chest. He was whining again, that same confused, unnatural whine he'd made at the start. What is wrong with you? Cade screamed, the tactical situation deteriorating with every second he remained stationary. Then Cade understood. The wrong scent from part one. The smell that had terrified the cadaver dog. It hadn't just been the 140-year-old remains. It was this spot. Shadow ignored Cade, breaking his heel command, a near unforgivable sin in canine training. He began to dig, frantically, his front paws throwing up geysers of wet black sand, not 3 feet from the Victorian chest. Shadow, no, but the dog was possessed. He was digging with a desperation Cade had never seen, as if trying to unearth something that was actively offending him. Cade, his heart hammering, his pistol still aimed at the silent, watching trees, was trapped. He couldn't abandon his partner. Find it. Find it fast! Cade yelled, pivoting on his heel, scanning the bluff, then the dog, then the bluff. Shadow's paws hit something. It didn't make the dull thud of wood. It made a sharp, hollow clack of plastic. The dog pulled back, barking, and grabbed a strap with his teeth, pulling an object from the shallow, sandy hole. Cade stared. His brain simply refused to process the image. It was a box. A small black hard-shell plastic case. A Pelican 1010. Modern. Waterproof. Indestructible. It was the kind of case Cade himself used to protect his spare ammo and his cell phone from the rain. It had been buried just beneath the surface, right next to the 140-year-old sea chest, as if they were buried together. But the Pelican case was barely dirty. It had been buried recently. Cade's mind fractured. He was holding a 19th century pistol, in his mind, metaphorically, standing over a 19th century grave, while a 21st century watcher aimed a rifle at him from the trees. And now this. Shadow dropped the case at Cade's feet, then immediately repositioned himself between Cade and the tree line, issuing that low, chest-vibrating growl once more. He was protecting his partner. Cade, his hands trembling, fumbled with his pistol, clumsy, and holstered it. He snatched the Pelican case. The latch was stiff. He put his thumb under it and snapped it open, a faint hiss of equalizing pressure. Inside, nestled in custom-cut gray foam, were 2 items. The first was a simple USB thumb drive. Black, no logo. The second was a laminated keycard. An access card. It was white with a magnetic stripe and a proximity chip. And on its face there was a logo, a stylized blue and green helix, the universal symbol for DNA wrapped around an 8-pointed compass, the same compass sigil that was on the chest and the grave. Beneath the logo, there was a corporate name, Ethelgard Biosystems Seattle. Geneva Cada Miller knew the name. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest knew the name. Ethelgard was a biotech behemoth, a global leader in genetic research and pharmaceuticals. They had a massive, gleaming new campus just across the Sound in Seattle. They were the future, and their logo was on a 140-year-old grave, and their access card was buried on a forgotten beach. This wasn't 2 mysteries. It was one. The journal's words flashed in his head. The asset is compromised. The key, Cade looked at the USB drive. The key, this wasn't a historical artifact. This was an active, modern intelligence drop. The watcher in the trees wasn't a ghost hunter. He wasn't guarding gold. He was corporate security, or corporate espionage, or something far, far worse. The long sleep wasn't just about the past. It was about hiding something. Hiding this, the woman in the chest. Was she the first key? Was this a new one? Cade shoved the Pelican case into his other cargo pocket, the hard plastic knocking against the supple leather of the Victorian journal. The past and the present, two halves of the same horrifying secret, were now in his possession. The gold, the locket, the bones. They were the history. The USB drive. That was the motive. The watcher in the trees wasn't just guarding a secret. He was waiting for a pickup Cade and Shadow had just intercepted. A wave crashed, colder and harder this time, surging up to his knees. It almost toppled him. The tide was coming, and it was coming fast. "Okay," Cade said, his voice a raw whisper. He grabbed Shadow's leash, and this time the dog didn't fight. "We're done. We're done. Let's go." He turned his back on the trees and ran. He didn't think. He ran. Cade Miller wasn't a young recruit, fresh from the academy and full of adrenaline. He was a 20-year veteran, and his body ran on a different fuel, a cold, pragmatic understanding of angles, exposure, and the lethal math of a high-velocity rifle round. "Go, go, go, Shadow," he grunted, yanking the leash, forcing the dog into a full-out sprint. He didn't run straight. He ran in a broken, zigzag pattern, his boots splashing in the surf, making him a chaotic, unpredictable target. He kept his head down, his weapon holstered. He knew he'd never make the shot, and trying to engage was suicide. His only priority was cover. The basalt rocks were 50 yards away. 50 yards of open, naked beach. His lungs burned. The cargo pockets, now heavy with the journal and the Pelican case, slapped against his thighs. The locket was a cold disc against his chest. He could feel the scope on his back, a burning, crawling sensation. The muzzle awareness that every cop learns to dread. He was waiting for the crack. The sound of the shot, arriving a split second after the bullet had already found its home. 10 more yards. Shadow was faster than him, a black blur at the end of the leash, pulling him forward. The dog understood the urgency, if not the reason. Cade didn't dive. He slid. He hit the cluster of black, seaweed-slicked rocks, his hip smashing against the unyielding stone. He grunted in pain, scrambling, dragging Shadow behind the largest boulder, a 10-foot-high wall of volcanic rock that faced the sea. He was out of the wind. He was, for the moment, safe. He collapsed against the rock, his pistol in his hand, his chest heaving. The sound of his own ragged breathing was deafening. Shadow, ever the professional, didn't panic. The dog stood beside him, low and quiet, his gaze locked on their back trail, his low growl a constant vibrating proximity alarm. "Good boy," Cade panted, putting a trembling hand on the dog's head. "Good boy. Watch him. He was alive. He was behind cover. He had the intel, and then he made the choice." He peered around the edge of the rock back toward the sea chest. He had to. He was a cop. He couldn't just abandon the scene, the remains, the gold. The tide was no longer creeping. It was surging. A massive wave, born from the remnants of the storm, crashed over the beach. Cade watched helpless as the black, swirling water engulfed the Victorian chest. The box, already compromised, was lifted, bobbed once, and then, with a terrible, final gurgle, it was sucked back into the ocean. The undertow dragged it, heavy as it was, scraping it along the sand until it vanished into the churning, gray-green water. It was gone. The gold, the silks, the rotted velvet. The skeleton. The woman in the locket, she was gone. Back to the sea, to the long sleep she had been ripped from. Cade felt a hollow sickness in his stomach. He had failed her. He'd disturbed her, taken her secrets, and then let the ocean reclaim her like so much driftwood. He leaned his head back against the cold rock, squeezing his eyes shut. "I'm sorry." He stayed like that for a full 10 seconds, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving behind the familiar ache of failure. Then he opened his eyes. The choice had already been made. He'd made it the second he'd pocketed the locket. He'd made it when he prioritized the journal over the gold. He looked down at his cargo pockets. He hadn't failed her. He had done the only thing he could. He had saved her story. The gold? The gold was just ballast. It was a distraction. A heavy, glittering anchor that would have drowned him. The real treasure was what he had right here. He unzipped the right-hand pocket, the one that felt cold and hard. He pulled out the pelican case. He unzipped the left-hand pocket, the one that felt soft and old. He pulled out the leather-bound journal. He held them side by side in his hands, the 21st century polymer and the 19th century leather. The watcher in the trees wasn't after the gold. He wasn't a treasure hunter. If he was, he would have been down on the beach digging, not hiding in the trees. He was waiting for the pelican case. He was waiting for the USB drive. Cade looked at the sigil on the journal's wax seal, which he'd broken. Then he looked at the key card in the case. The 8-pointed compass, the fouled anchor, Ethelgard Biosystems, Seattle, Geneva. This isn't a new conspiracy. The thought was sharp, crystalline. It's the same one. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't two separate secrets colliding. This was a pattern. This was a tradecraft, a dead-drop procedure passed down for 140 years. The woman in the locket, she was the first courier. She was trying to get her key, the journal, the gold, to the fifth harbor, this island. And she failed, dying on its shore. And now, 140 years later, someone else in the same organization, this Covenant, was still using this remote, forgotten beach as a drop site. Using the same sigil, they had buried the modern key, the USB drive, right next to the grave of the first failed courier. Maybe it was a ritual. Maybe it was just operational security. Cade had just walked straight into the middle of a handoff. The watcher wasn't guarding the grave. He was the recipient. He was here to pick up the drive. And Cade Miller, the lone island cop, had just stolen his package. This changed the math. The watcher wasn't just a guard. He was an operative, which meant he was professional, he was armed, and he would not be leaving this island without that USB drive. Cade looked at the two objects in his hands. The journal with its cryptic 19th century warnings. The USB drive with its cold 21st century data. He shoved them both back into his pockets and zipped them tight. The weight of his choice was suddenly crushing. He was a small-town cop holding a secret that connected a modern, multi-billion-dollar biotech giant to a 140-year-old conspiracy. A secret that someone was actively right now willing to kill for. His radio was dead. He was cut off. He and Shadow were officially on their own. He put his hand on Shadow's ruff. The dog was still rigid, still watching. "Okay, boy," Cade whispered, his voice hoarse. "Now we know. It's not history. It's not a cold case. It's active. And they know we have it." He clicked the leash. "We move. We don't use the trails. We stick to the rocks. We go cross-country. We get to the truck." He took one last look around the rock, back toward the bluff where the watcher was hidden. He needed to see if he was being flanked. He peered into the gloom. And the gloom fired back. It wasn't a bang. It was a crack thump, the dry, supersonic crack of the bullet passing, followed a split second later by the thump of the rifle's report echoing from the bluff. Cade didn't hear it. He felt it. The bullet struck the basalt rock he was hiding behind precisely at the edge he'd been peering around. It hit with the force of a sledgehammer, vaporizing a chunk of stone. A spray of pulverized rock and superheated lead shrapnel stung Cade's face like a blast from a sandblaster. He screamed, not in pain but in shock, falling back, his ears ringing with a deafening, high-pitched whine. But Shadow shrieked. It was a sound of pure agony. A high, thin, terrified scream that ripped Cade's soul apart. Cade's vision swam. He wiped his face, his glove coming away smeared with grit and a smear of his own blood from a shrapnel cut on his cheek. He looked at Shadow. The dog was down. He was on his side on the sand, his back legs kicking uselessly. The bullet's shrapnel, the fragments of stone and lead, had peppered the dog's left flank. "No!" It was a roar, a primal sound torn from Cade's chest. The tactical veteran cop evaporated, replaced by the man. The watcher in the trees hadn't just shot at him. They had aimed for the rock he was looking around. They were a marksman. They knew he was there, and they had hit his dog. "No, you son of a bitch!" Cade roared, his voice breaking. He snapped his pistol up. He didn't aim. He didn't take cover. He stood up, exposed, and emptied his magazine toward the bluff. He fired all 15 rounds in a blur of desperate, useless rage. The bang-bang-bang of his 9mm pistol was a pathetic, tinny popgun against the vast, thundering silence of the island. He was firing at a ghost. He knew it. But the rage demanded it. The last slide locked back on an empty chamber. The sudden, profound click was the loudest sound in the world. He was out. He was exposed. And he had just given away his exact position. A fool's move. A rookie's move. A handler's move! Shadow! He dropped to his knees beside his partner. The dog was whimpering, his dark eyes wide with pain and confusion. The flank was a mess of blood and torn fur. But as Cade's trembling fingers probed, he realized with a wave of sickening relief that it wasn't a direct hit. It was shrapnel. Bad, but maybe not fatal. I got you. I got you, boy. We're getting out of here. Cade didn't have a spare second. The shooter on the bluff was reloading or repositioning for a cleaner shot. He jammed his empty pistol back into its holster. He couldn't carry the 70-pound Malinois. Not and run. Get up, he begged, his voice cracking. Shadow, up. Come on. He hauled the dog by the scruff, pulling him to his feet. Shadow stumbled, his left hind leg buckling, but he stayed up, shaking, whining. Okay. Good boy. Run. Cade grabbed the leash and did the only thing he could. He ran, dragging his wounded partner, abandoning the cover of the rocks. He ran for the only other cover available. The tree line, the very forest the shooter was in, but further down the beach. He didn't zigzag. He didn't think. He just ran, his body low, his hand on Shadow's back, half pulling, half carrying him, pushing him forward. The crack thump came again. This time the bullet kicked up a spray of water just inches from Cade's running feet. The shooter wasn't just a guard. He was a professional. He was toying with them. That shot wasn't a miss. It was a warning. The same kind of warning shot he'd fired at Shadow's feet earlier. It wasn't a warning to leave. It was a warning to stop. It was a message, drop the package. You can't escape. Cade ignored it. He hit the edge of the beach, his boots sinking into the soft soil and pine needles at the forest's edge. He plunged into the shadows, into the deep dark green of the island, dragging Shadow behind him. They were in. They were out of the open. He fell against the trunk of a massive 1,000-year-old Sitka spruce, his lungs on fire, his entire body shaking. Shadow collapsed at his feet, panting, his blood a dark, hot stain on the moss. Cade ripped his medkit from his belt, his hands fumbling with the snaps. He poured clotting powder, quick clot designed for gunshot wounds, onto the worst of the shrapnel tears. Pressing his hand down hard, Shadow yelped, then licked Cade's wrist, a gesture of trust that shattered Cade's heart. I know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, boy, Cade whispered, his face buried in the dog's ruff, breathing in the scent of fur, blood, and ozone. He sat there for a full minute, the forest silent around them. The only sound was the distant rhythmic crash of the surf. The hunter in the trees had gone silent. He didn't need to shoot. Cade Miller was trapped. He was on an island, cut off from the world. His dog was wounded. His radio was dead. And somewhere in the trees with him was a professional marksman with a high-powered rifle. A man who represented a multi-billion-dollar corporation and a 140-year-old conspiracy. And Cade had everything he wanted. Cade touched his cargo pockets. The journal. The USB drive. He zipped his breast pocket, his fingers brushing the small hard oval of the locket. He had the woman's tragedy. He had the Covenant's key. He had the modern motive. He was no longer a cop on patrol. He was a guardian. He was the man who had inherited the watch from the nameless grave on the hill. He looked down at Shadow, who was now quietly licking his own wound, his eyes fixed on his partner. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. He was outmanned and outgunned, but he wasn't alone. He had Shadow. And he had the secret, and on this island, his island. That would have to be enough. Thank you so much for following Cade and Shadow on this discovery. Their story is just beginning and the island is not ready to give up its secrets. We're left with so many questions, but I have to ask you. What do you think is on that USB drive? And what is Ethelgard Biosystems so desperate to keep hidden? Let me know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe because the hunt has just begun.